There's a fragment sitting in a museum in Jerusalem right now. It's smaller than your hand. It's been sitting in storage for over 60 years. And on it, written in ink that bled into animal skin 2,000 years ago, are 17 lines from the book of Jeremiah. Scholars found it in Cave 4 near the Dead Sea in the 1950s. They cataloged it. They filed it under Jeremiah, and then they moved on. For 60 years, nobody asked one question. A question so simple it's almost embarrassing. What animal did this come from? That question sat unanswered for 6 decades, and when someone finally asked it and got the answer, it broke something. Not a small thing, something enormous, something that touches every Bible sitting on a shelf in every home in the world right now, because the answer was a cow, not a sheep, not a goat, a cow. And cows cannot survive in the Judean desert. There is no grass. There is no water. There is nothing out there that a cow can live on. Which means this fragment, this piece of the book of Jeremiah, hidden in a desert cave for 2 millennia, was never made in the desert. It was made somewhere else, by someone else, and then it was carried to that cave. Professor Oded Rechavi had been working on this problem for 7 years. He runs a genetics lab at Tel Aviv University in Israel, and he asked his team a question that sounds almost philosophical. Imagine that Israel is destroyed to the ground and only one library survives, the library of an isolated extremist sect. What could we deduce from this library about Greater Israel? That question drove a 7-year study, and the answer arrived in a piece of cowskin the size of a postage stamp. Stay with me, because this is the reason this video exists. What they found inside that fragment didn't just tell us something new about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It told us something about where your Bible, or any ancient scripture, actually came from. If lost histories hidden inside ancient DNA are what you came here for, subscribe. Because what I'm about to show you is only the beginning. The scroll they found in that cave wasn't just a version of Jeremiah. There were 2 cowskin fragments of Jeremiah, both from the same cave, and both of them were versions of Jeremiah that no longer exist in any Bible printed today. Think about that for a second. We have a date for that fragment. Carbon dating places it at around 50 BCE, 2,000 years old. But here's the thing nobody talks about. If that scroll arrived at Qumran from somewhere else, then the date we have isn't the story of the scroll. It's the date of its exile. And those are 2 completely different stories. Real quick, before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where something you believed your whole life turned out to be more complicated than you were told? Doesn't have to be about religion. Could be your family history, your ancestry, anything. Drop it in the comments. Because that feeling, that specific feeling, is exactly what these fragments did to 70 years of scholarship. I'll be reading every single one. Now, let's follow the cowskin Jeremiah back to where it came from. Exile is the right word. Because the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the modern era is itself a story about who gets to control a narrative, and what happens when that control goes unchallenged for too long. Here's something most documentaries skip. In 1954, an Israeli general named Yigael Yadin placed an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal. He was buying scrolls, but he didn't use his real name. He didn't reveal he was Israeli. He used a false identity, because if Jordan knew an Israeli military figure was buying Dead Sea Scroll fragments, the purchase would be blocked. The scrolls ended up in Israeli hands. And for the next 37 years, access to the full corpus was restricted to a committee of 8 scholars, 8 people, for 37 years. And during those 3+ decades, the consensus hardened into something almost immovable. One sect, one location, one tradition. The Essenes, a small radical Jewish group, wrote the scrolls at Qumran. End of story. The DNA study that finally challenged this was published in June 2020. And here's what makes the delay so uncomfortable. The technology to extract ancient DNA from parchment had been demonstrated in peer-reviewed research years before that. A 2015 paper confirmed that parchment is actually a reliable place for ancient DNA to survive, even after centuries of rough treatment, contamination, and handling. The technology existed. The scrolls were sitting there. Nobody ran the test. This gap has never been fully explained. And here's what the DNA actually revealed when they finally did run it. The textual matching that scholars had been doing for 70 years, connecting fragments based on writing style, vocabulary, ink composition, turned out to have a fundamental flaw. Fragments assumed to come from the same scroll, because they read like a match, were proved by genetics to come from different animals, different herds, and potentially different regions entirely. Reading ability is not the same as physical evidence, and for 7 decades, reading ability was all we had. In 1991, the Huntington Library in California broke the monopoly. They publicly released photographs of the full Dead Sea Scrolls corpus, without permission. The 8-scholar committee was furious. The argument that followed was dressed up as a debate about scholarly ethics. But what the DNA study published 3 decades later quietly confirms is this: the monopoly had real consequences. 3 decades of restricted access meant 3 decades of unchallenged assumptions. Professor Rechavi's question, "What can one library really tell you about a whole civilization?" had been sitting unanswered the entire time, not because it was too hard to answer, but because not enough people were allowed to ask it. The Essenes, in all of this, became the default answer. One sect, one place, every scroll, their product. But the DNA says something different about that. The DNA says the Essenes may have been primarily the curators of this library, not its only creators. So if the Essenes were curators, who were the creators? The answer came from a genetics lab in Sweden, down from a scientist who had never read the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 2018, Professor Mattias Jakobsson received a package at Uppsala University. Inside were fragments of ancient parchment, pieces the size of rice grains, no writing on them, just the backside of leather that had been sitting in a cave for 2,000 years. Jakobsson is a population geneticist. He spent his career studying how populations move, mix, and leave biological signatures in the organisms they lived alongside. He specializes in ancient DNA. He does not specialize in scripture. And that, it turns out, is exactly why he was the right person for this. Here's where it gets strange, because the sheep didn't just tell his team where the scrolls came from, they told them which scrolls belonged together. But Jakobsson's team extracted mitochondrial and nuclear DNA from the fragments, the actual genetic code preserved inside the animal cells of the leather itself. They then compared the haplogroups, basically the genetic family trees, of the different animals. And what they found was that certain fragments clustered together. Their animals were closely related, same genetic lineage, possibly the same herd, possibly the same patch of Judean hillside. 8 fragments formed a particularly tight cluster, local to Qumran, genetically consistent with sheep raised in the desert environment near the caves. And here's the twist that caught even the researchers off guard. The Great Isaiah Scroll, the most famous scroll in the entire collection, 7.34 meters long, or the most complete ancient manuscript of the book of Isaiah that exists, had been argued by some scholars to be stitched together from multiple different scribal traditions, different hands, different places. The DNA showed the exact opposite. Every sampled section came from genetically related sheep, one flock, one region, one community's work. The scroll that looked the most diverse turned out to be the most unified. The DNA resolved a debate that textual analysis had been running for decades, and it resolved it in the opposite direction. That scroll, by the way, spent its first months in the modern world under a priest's bed. Archbishop Mar Athanasius Samuel of the Syrian Orthodox Church bought it in 1947 without fully understanding what it was. He stored it in his residence in Bethlehem. Was the scroll that just proved its own unity after 2,000 years spent several months under a mattress. But here's what haplogroup analysis can do beyond just identifying location. In the ancient world, livestock herds were institutional assets. Priestly families owned them. Scribal schools managed them. Temple networks ran their economies on them. If you can trace the genetic lineage of an animal to a specific region, you're not just finding a place. You're circling an organization, a network, the people who owned those sheep, and the sheep outlasted all of them. 2,000 years later, their mitochondrial signature is still present in sheep populations living on those same Levantine hillsides. The animals changed almost nothing. The humans who owned them were displaced, renamed, and scattered across the world multiple times over. The sheep remember what the history books erased. 2 signatures in the archive had no match. And what they revealed is something that most people who read the Bible every day have no idea about. There is not one book of Jeremiah. There are two. The version in the Hebrew Bible, the text that became the foundation of what most people know as the Old Testament, is around 14,000 words long. The version preserved in the ancient Greek Septuagint translation is about 3,000 words shorter, and it's arranged in a completely different order. Scholars have known this for centuries. They called it translation variance. They argued it was abbreviation, scribal error, adaptation for a Greek-speaking audience. There were explanations, comfortable ones. Then the cowskin dissolved every single one of them. Professor Noam Mizrahi, who runs the Biblical Studies Department at Tel Aviv University and co-led this research, put it plainly. He said, "Since late antiquity, there has been almost complete uniformity of the biblical text. A Torah scroll in a synagogue in Kiev would be virtually identical to one in Sydney, down to the letter. By contrast, in Qumran, we find in the very same cave different versions of the same book. Not copies, not translations, different versions. And the DNA proved they came from different communities in different locations. The cowskin fragment 4Q70 contains a version of Jeremiah closer to the shorter Greek text, one that focuses on the prophet's personal relationship with God, his suffering, the intimacy of divine communication. The other cowskin fragment, 4Q72b, carries a different variant still. Neither of them matches the Masoretic text, the Hebrew standard that became the backbone of the Bible as most people know it today. These weren't scribal mistakes. These were two communities saying two genuinely different things about the same prophet. And now, this is the moment I want you to stay with me for, because this is the part that changes how you see everything that came before it. The version of Jeremiah that survived in the modern Bible was not chosen because it was older, or more accurate, or more theologically sound. It survived because the community that believed in it had the institutional infrastructure to survive a catastrophe. The cowskin communities, the ones who believed in the shorter, more intimate Jeremiah, didn't make it. Their scribal schools, their temple networks, their patronage systems were destroyed when Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE. The texts that survived the biblical canonization process were the texts whose communities survived. Full stop. Actually, if you watched my last video on the Kurds and the DNA that shouldn't exist, you already know what it looks like when a community's biology outlasts everything designed to erase it. The cowskin Jeremiahs are the same story. The communities are gone, but their words survived in the one place nobody thought to look. Did that change how you see this? Tell me in the comments, and then stay with me, because what comes next removes any remaining doubt. Everything I've told you about the Essene so far, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. The 2020 study that revealed all of this sequenced 26 fragments, showing the total Dead Sea Scrolls corpus has over 25,000 fragments. The number 26 is in every headline about this discovery. What almost no headline mentions is the other number, 24,974 fragments, untested, sitting in drawers. We built an entirely new understanding of where the Bible came from on 0.1% of the available evidence. But here is what that 0.1% actually confirmed. The Essenes did write the scrolls, some of them, and here's why that matters, because for a moment, things actually got clean. 8 of the 26 sequenced fragments share haplogroup proximity so tight that the animals almost certainly came from the same flock, maybe even the same pasture. These 8 fragments had been tentatively linked by scholars for decades, based on writing style, ink composition, scribal conventions. The DNA confirmed the connection. Every one of those 8 fragments was consistent with sheep raised locally in the desert environment near the caves, and not just any fragments, the community rule scroll, the Damascus document, the war scroll. The most doctrinally extreme, most explicitly sectarian texts in the entire corpus, the ones that sound most like the writings of one isolated radical group, are, genetically, from one isolated local group. The sheep haplogroups prove it. For one clean moment, the system works. There are 3 things the DNA confirmed about the Essenes. The third one changes what the first 2 seem to prove. The first, yes, they wrote their own sectarian texts on their own local sheep in their own desert caves. Confirmed. The second, yes, the great Isaiah scroll, the most unified of all the major finds, came from one community's flock. The diversity argument dies here. The third, the Essenes were also collecting, actively, deliberately. They stored the cowskin Jeremiahs from outside communities. They kept the temple scroll, nearly 9 meters long, claiming to be God's direct speech to Moses, rewriting and expanding Deuteronomy, even though, based on available evidence, it wasn't written there. It was brought in, stored, preserved, treated as sacred by people whose own theology didn't fully align with its claims. The most sectarian community in Second Temple Judaism was running the most theologically open archive in the region. Think about what that means. These are people history remembers for turning their backs on mainstream Jewish society, for going into the desert, for separating themselves. And yet in the library they built, in the physical collection of animal skins they preserved, they were holding on to competing traditions, rival versions, outside voices. The isolation protected the plurality. The Essene community was not a theological monoculture. It was a firewall, a deliberate archive built by people who understood that something was coming, something catastrophic, and that when it arrived, a library with only one voice would be a library with nothing worth saving. Someone at Qumran made a choice, breadth over purity. And now, this is where the floor shifts again. Because if the Qumran library was plural, if it was designed to hold competing traditions, not just its own, then the question isn't just who wrote the scrolls. The question is, whose voices are missing from the collection? How many communities contributed, and how many of them left no trace except the genetic signature of their animals? If the library was plural, whose voices are missing from the census? The cowskin Jeremiah scrolls came from a community that was not Essene, not desert-dwelling, not Qumran. They were produced somewhere with cattle, somewhere with grass and water. The Judean highlands, possibly. Jerusalem itself, possibly. One of the agricultural settlements to the north of the Dead Sea. The DNA tells us the animal. It cannot tell us the scribes' names. It cannot tell us what they called themselves. We know they're Jeremiah. We don't know their name for God. This isn't just ancient history. The version of Jeremiah that survived, the one in your Bible right now, was chosen after these people were gone. Son, the version they believed in is in a cave, written on a cow's skin, and we don't have a single word that tells us who they were. The shorter version of Jeremiah they wrote is not a lesser text. It's a different relationship with the same prophet. The Hebrew Masoretic version that survived in canon emphasizes national covenant, the collective destiny of a people, prophetic authority within an institutional structure. The shorter version, the one on the cowskin, focuses on Jeremiah's personal pain, the intimacy between a human being and God, the cost of prophecy on one individual man's life. These are two genuinely different theological traditions, not copies of each other, not mistranslations, two ways of understanding what it means to hear the word of God, and one of them was erased, not erased by design necessarily, erased by catastrophe. When Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, it didn't just destroy a city. It destroyed the patronage networks, the scribal schools, the priestly families, the administrative infrastructure that had sustained these rival traditions for generations. The cowskin communities left no Josephus to document them, no institutional records, no surviving texts with their names attached. They left 2 pieces of hide in a cave, and nothing else. Here's something that lands harder the more you sit with it. The prophet Jeremiah himself lived through the first destruction of Jerusalem, the Babylonian siege of 586 BCE. He watched the city fall. He wrote about it. The communities that were copying him in 50 BCE were doing so in the shadow of a second destruction they could feel coming. They were archiving a prophet who survived one catastrophe in a cave before another catastrophe arrived. Jeremiah survived Babylon. His words survived Rome. But the communities who believed a particular version of those words did not, and they may not be alone. There may be dozens of unnamed communities in the 24,974 unsequenced fragments. Scribal schools whose texts lost the canonical vote, not because they were wrong, but because their people were gone by the time anyone was counting votes. The Dead Sea Scrolls may contain the genetic fingerprints, written in animal DNA, of an entire religious world that was erased from the official record. We are sitting on the most important archive of lost theology in existence. Most of it hasn't been opened. One of those boxes contained a fragment that broke the most heroic story in the scroll's entire modern history. Masada, 73 CE, a mountaintop fortress above the Dead Sea. 960 Jewish rebels, not Essenes, but Sicarii, holding their ground against Rome's 10th Legion for 3 years after Jerusalem had already fallen. When the Romans finally breached the walls, they found the defenders had taken their own lives rather than submit. They also found scrolls, including a fragment of a liturgical text called the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, a composition also found in multiple copies in the Qumran caves. The connection seemed obvious. Moving. Scholars drew the conclusion that some Essenes had survived the Roman advance by fleeing south to Masada, carrying their sacred library with them. The Qumran scrolls and the Masada scroll were siblings, separated in the chaos of war, but from the same family. It was a beautiful story, and the DNA took it apart. The Masada fragment is sheepskin, but from a haplogroup entirely unrelated to any sheep identified in the Qumran corpus. Professor Mizrahi was direct about what this means. The Masada scroll did not originate in the Qumran caves. It was brought from somewhere else, not by Essene refugees, by people from a different community entirely, a third tradition. What they found next dismantled 60 years of one of the most emotionally satisfying stories in archaeology. Because this third community wrote like the Qumran sect. Their scribal conventions, their textual style, their theological orientation, close enough that scholars had been reading their work as Essene for decades. But scribal style can be taught. A teacher can travel. A tradition can spread from community to community. What cannot travel is the mitochondrial lineage of the sheep, and that lineage says, not Qumran. The man who originally connected the Masada fragment to Qumran was Yigael Yadin, the same general who bought scrolls through a classified ad, the man who became Israel's most celebrated archaeologist. He excavated Masada between 1963 and 1965. He identified the fragment. His connection became standard in the field. And then he died in 1984, 36 years before the DNA study that proved him wrong. He went to his grave, believing the Essenes had carried their library to the mountain. The sheep say they didn't. Now, there's something else in this finding that almost nobody reported. Professor Mizrahi noted that the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice may have been what he called a bestseller in the ancient world. 10 copies found in the Qumran caves alone. More copies than some biblical books. And now, the Masada fragment proves the text was circulating outside Qumran entirely. It wasn't just sectarian, it was widespread. And the tradition underlying it, the one connecting human prayer to the divine throne, continued, Professor Mizrahi argues, in hidden channels through the Middle Ages. A tradition that scholars thought died in the Judean desert was actually still alive, just under a different name. That finding was published as part of the 2020 Cell study. It appeared in the supplementary analysis. No major outlet ran the headline, DNA proves the Masada escape story is wrong. Additional data. And that's what they filed it under. Additional data is how civilizations decide what gets remembered. Around 90 CE, 20 years after Rome burned Jerusalem, a group of surviving rabbis gathered in a small coastal town called Yavne. They were what remained of the institutional infrastructure of Judaism. The Essenes were gone, the Sadducees were gone, the temple was rubble, and these rabbis had a task: decide which sacred texts were authoritative, which versions, which books, which words. The cowskin communities had no seat at that table. They were already gone. Professor Noam Mizrahi explained what this means more precisely than anyone else has. Before 70 CE, he said, the controversy between Jewish communities was about interpretation, what the texts meant, how to apply them, which group understood the law correctly. No, the exact wording of the text was somewhat secondary. Multiple versions of a book could coexist because meaning was what mattered. After 70 CE, that changed. Standardization became survival. One version, one text, one way. The cowskin Jeremiah communities lost, not because their theology was weaker. They lost because they weren't there to argue for it. Everything I've told you about the Qumran library, hold on to it. because it's about to prove something that reaches far beyond the Judean desert. This challenge, how to preserve a sacred text when multiple legitimate versions exist across a fragmented community, is a challenge every major faith tradition has navigated in its own way. And in every case, the people who made those decisions were acting in good faith, under real historical pressure, were trying to protect something they believed was sacred from being lost entirely. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us something rare, the archaeological record of the world that existed before those decisions were made, the full, plural, pre-canonical landscape, the moment right before the vote. There's a 3rd century Christian scholar named Origen of Alexandria who understood this earlier than anyone. He compiled something called the Hexapla, 6 parallel columns of the Old Testament, placed side by side, including the shorter Greek version of Jeremiah. He was doing what a scientist would do, documenting the variation, rather than pretending it didn't exist. The church later decided the Hexapla was dangerous. Most of it was destroyed. What Origen preserved survives today only in fragments. He was 1,700 years ahead of the DNA study. And the institution he worked within destroyed his evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the largest surviving window into the world before standardization, before the canonical votes, before the survival filters. They are a snapshot of a religious ecosystem that was diverse enough, plural enough, contested enough, that it required a catastrophe to narrow it down to one voice. And here's the thing that will not leave me alone. The community whose theological profile most closely mirrors the Qumran sectarians, apocalyptic, priestly-focused, calendar-obsessed, rejecting the Jerusalem temple hierarchy, believing themselves to be remnants of a cosmic conflict, doesn't emerge cleanly from the Essene tradition in the historical record. So the closest structural and textual parallels to Qumran doctrine appear in early communities in Egypt and Syria. 2 traditions that modern religious history has always kept in separate categories may have shared a pre-canonical theological root that predates both of them. The scrolls aren't just evidence of one lost sect. They may be evidence of a shared origin that was divided, renamed, and then, in both directions, told it was unique. The parent tradition's archive is still 99.9% unread. Right now, in a climate-controlled facility inside the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, there are approximately 25,000 scroll fragments. They are stored carefully, preserved. And as of the study published in 2020, 26 of them have been genetically sequenced. 26. The DNA survived 2,000 years of desert heat, cave air, and rough handling by dozens of people who didn't always wear gloves. It survived all of that. And there is a real concern, a documented scientific concern, that it may not survive another generation of institutional delay. Parchment degrades. DNA inside it degrades with it, slowly but persistently. Stay with me, because the reason this hasn't been done is not what you think. It's not the technology. Professor Christopher Mason at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York was part of this same research team. His lab contributed the metagenomics methodology, the technique for reading DNA from incredibly fragmentary, contaminated material. His team demonstrated that you can extract meaningful ancient DNA from a sample so small it produces no visible damage to the fragment. A rice grain, less than a rice grain. The technology works. Yeah, the sample size is minimal. The damage to the artifact is negligible. The limiting factor is permission. The Israel Antiquities Authority oversees the scrolls. They operate in an environment where these fragments are simultaneously scientific specimens, national heritage objects, religious relics, and subjects of ongoing legal disputes about ownership and provenance. Getting authorization for sampling involves institutional bodies, legal considerations, political sensitivities, and competing priorities that have nothing to do with science. Science is waiting for bureaucracy. And while it waits, something else has been happening to the scrolls, something that has made the entire situation more complicated and more expensive. In 2020, the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., revealed that 16 Dead Sea Scroll fragments it had purchased for approximately $11 million were modern forgeries, sophisticated ones, genuine ancient leather, forged ink. The fragments had passed initial authentication, The gray market antiquities trade that moved scroll fragments in the 1950s had become, by the 2000s and 2010s, a commercial ecosystem generating industrial-scale counterfeits. $11 million on fakes, while the real ones continued to degrade in their drawers. Here's the full weight of the problem. The 26 fragments that were sequenced were the most accessible samples in the corpus, the most authenticated, the most bureaucratically available, the easiest ones to reach. We built a new model of where the Bible came from on the floor, fragments of the archive. We don't know what's on the upper shelves. There are private collectors who hold scroll fragments that have never been officially reported. There are pieces that passed through unmonitored hands in the 1950s and have not been publicly located since. The gray market scattered pieces of this library across the world before anyone understood what they were holding. And one of those missing fragments may carry the genetic signature of a community no one has identified yet. A scribal tradition, a version of a book we think we know, a prayer from a people whose name we never learned. The DNA of the scroll animals carries something else too, something that the researchers found in the comparative haplogroup data, a genetic bottleneck in certain Judean sheep populations, a sudden, severe narrowing of genetic diversity, time to between 50 BCE and 100 CE, in the same window as the Roman conquest of Judea. The sheep that carried the words of God were nearly wiped out in the same catastrophe that destroyed the people who wrote them. Not metaphorically, literally. Cave 4, Qumran, 1952. Archaeologists didn't find it through systematic survey. The cave had already been found and partially emptied by local Bedouin who needed money. By the time the scholars arrived, fragments had been removed and sold. The first contact between modern hands and 2,000-year-old sacred texts was a commercial transaction, an economic exchange. Someone needed cash, someone else was buying. This is how the most important library in the history of religious thought re-entered the world. And somewhere in those 24,974 unsequenced fragments, in a drawer in Jerusalem or a private collection in Switzerland, or a safe somewhere in Geneva, there may be a scroll written on the skin of an animal from a community we have never identified, a version of Exodus, a letter, a psalm that didn't survive the canonical vote, a prayer from a tradition whose name was burned along with its city. If that's the kind of history that keeps you up at night, if ancient DNA and the lost voices inside it are what brought you here, subscribe, because this archive is still being studied, and not all of the fragments have been found yet. The book of Jeremiah contains a verse, chapter 36, verse 23. King Jehoiakim is sitting in his winter palace. A scribe is reading a scroll to him. Every time 3 or 4 columns are read aloud, the king takes a knife, cuts that section out of the scroll, and throws it into the fire burning beside him, column by column. So he burns the entire scroll. The prophet Jeremiah is told what happened, and he dictates it again, from memory. The word survives the king who burned it, but Jeremiah wrote 2 versions of his book. One survived in Hebrew, one survived in Greek, one survived on a cow's skin in a cave above the Dead Sea, and the king who burned the first copy has been dead for 2,600 years. The fire didn't destroy the word, it just decided which version of the word you would be allowed to hear.